is a resident scholar at SAIS. He writes about China. He was the Los Angeles Times bureau chief in Beijing for many years. He wrote a wonderful book called The Beijing Jeep. And also has written several other books on China. And also one of the very popular book is about the current Bush administration and the key players. It's called The Rise of the Balkans. Jim Mann is a friend and a very well-known China scholar. He has written a lot about China from a very unique perspective. Often determines the turn of the discourse on China. So without further ado, and I'm going to introduce Mr. Jim Mann. He's talking about will capitalism bring democracy to China and any other China-related issues that you might have. And he'll give for about 25 to 30 minutes talk, and followed by Q&A. Jim.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to discuss today the ideas that I explored in a book I wrote last year called The China Fantasy. And the China Fantasy is, as the title of the lecture suggests, the idea that trade, investment, and capitalism are going to lead to democracy in China. That China is inevitably or destined to undergo some kind of political liberalization that will bring an end to the current one-party state and to the repression of dissent and organized political opposition. And since I'm speaking here, I want to caution that the book really is not about pure security issues as such. In fact, what I try to say is it's really independent of the question of, quote, a China threat. In fact, I conclude that that's a whole separate issue, but let's just put aside and assume that at the present moment, China's not a threat. That's not what I'm talking about here. And one other caveat, I'm really talking, my perspective and what I'm really trying to understand, it's not so much China itself, but American attitudes and assumptions towards China as they are now, and really as they've evolved over the past quarter century. I mean, I lived in China as a newspaper correspondent a good while ago. I'm not make no pretenses to being in touch with the day-to-day situation in China now. I'm the wrong person to ask on that, but I don't think there's any dispute about the fundamental political facts that I'm talking about, really, that there is, at the moment, a severe repression of any organized political opposition to the ruling Communist Party. And that was brought home to all of us, I think, a few weeks ago in the Olympics. The example I like is, sad as it is, China, in order to comply with the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, promised to allow a few selected sites in Beijing for protest, and then during the games turned down every single request. I think I counted, I was up to 0 for 70 or 0 for 75, and in some cases detained those who requested permission to protest at these vacant sites. So, I think there's not a lot of disagreement about what the situation is today. What I've been amazed to watch in this country is how certain ideas and formulations and assumptions about China's future persist. So I want to let's take a look. Let's think for a minute about China's future. Where is it headed? And the way I see it, there are really three different scenarios. The first, the one I'm going to focus on the most, is I call the soothing scenario, that the current political system is going to inevitably change, open up into a more open political system. And that's, I would call the governing assumption of public political discourse on China. This is not, it's not a partisan issue at all. I mean, you have Bill Clinton saying that political change is coming to China just as inevitably the Berlin Wall fell, and current President Bush saying we trade freely with China and time is on our side. Shows up overseas. Tony Blair a couple years ago said there's an unstoppable momentum towards democracy in China. Columnist Tom Friedman, China's going to have a free press, globalization will drive it. I think this is the dominant assumption about China in this country today. Well, that's, however, only one of three scenarios for China's future. Another one is I call the upheaval scenario, which is that China, that basically in the vernacular, China is going to blow, that it's going to blow up. It can't go on the way it is now, that the country is going to, one sees today, protests, strikes, or financial problems in the banking system. And this idea of China's future was encapsulated in a book maybe 7 or 8 years ago by an author named Gordon Chang, who called it The Coming Collapse of China. And it's an interesting, thoughtful book. I personally am not persuaded. I think that China's a big country, and it's managed to hold itself together for a long time. I don't see any signs of collapse. In fact, I see fewer today than I did at the time the book came out. So that's the second scenario. And then the third scenario, which gets very little attention, is that what we see in China right now is what we're going to get and see for a long time. And that's the reality that quite a few people in this country keep trying to avoid. And there's a whole, I try to describe in my book, this goes right down to semantics and vocabulary. There's a whole, what I call a lexicon of dismissal, of words used to try and undermine any criticism of China. So if people are negative about or critical of China's future, the first label is China basher. That's an epithet that I don't like any more than frankly, on the other side, I don't like the epithet panda hugger for people who are sympathetic of China either. Because what's being criticized is not China as a country or the Chinese people, but the ruling party's determination to block any political opposition. Now let me go into a little history here of American attitudes towards China. I'll start with the Nixon opening, which was just, and the question is, how do you justify America's relationship with China to the public, to Congress, to the American people? At the time of the Nixon opening, this was justified to the public, largely in strategic terms. There was a lot of romance about China. Understandably, Americans hadn't been there for decades. And Nixon and Henry Kissinger were arguing rightly, as people had for a while, that the U.S. couldn't just pretend China didn't exist. But it wasn't justified. The opening to China wasn't justified as promoting democracy. Let's move ahead a few years to the Carter administration, and Mao Zedong has died, Deng Xiaoping has taken over, and you see in China the democracy wall movement of 1979, 1980. And China, after a brief period of time, really wraps up the democracy wall movement and puts many of its leaders into jail. So what attitude does the United States take? Well, the byword at that time, and it was true, was, well, things are better than they used to be. China may be repressing dissent, but it's not as bad. Things aren't as bad as they were during the Cultural Revolution. That's certainly true, but it's an attitude that has persisted, on now for about going near 30 years, and to the point where you say, are things changing or getting better now? Why do we still keep comparing China to the worst of the Cultural Revolution? And we move ahead to after the Tiananmen upheavals, massacre of 1989, American policy attitudes, ideas towards China really go into, thrown up in the air, not just by Tiananmen itself, but also by certainly the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet collapse. And the first Bush administration really kind of, it proceeds with maintaining an American relationship with China, but really doesn't quite come up with a rationale for it. There was one odd moment. George Bush Sr. at a press conference started suggesting we need China as a counterweight against the rising power of Japan. That was quickly, that was quickly dropped. And really there was no governing idea about American policy towards China. And then you get in 1992 the Clinton campaign. Everybody seems to remember now Clinton's lines about the Bush administration coddling dictators from Baghdad to Beijing. Actually, the most interesting moment of the Clinton campaign was the suggestion on China was the suggestion that in the aftermath of the Cold War, China was not as strategically important to the United States as it used to be. And the one-liner that Clinton used during the campaign, very few people noticed it, is it makes no sense for the United States to play the China card when there's no one else at the table. And that no one else, of course, would be the Soviet Union. But eventually, after a couple years in office and some back and forth, the Clinton campaign really came up with what is now I think the governing assumption or rationale to the public for American attitudes towards China, for American policy towards China, which is that economic change will inevitably bring political change to China, even if its leaders don't want it, that there will be a process from below or somehow China will inevitably open up. Now let me step back 1 second before I turn to the China fantasy and talk about the constituencies that underlie the China fantasy. Because holding out the idea that to the American public that China is about to change has over time served changing interests in Washington and in American society. So in the 1970s and 1980s, the idea benefited really national security thinking, because at the time, as I said, the United States was seeking close cooperation with China against the Soviet Union, so that the Soviet Union would have to worry about both America and China at once. And the Pentagon was eager to ensure that the Soviet Union was required to deploy large numbers of troops along the Sino-Soviet border that might otherwise have been deployed to Europe. So that, the idea of cooperation with China against the Soviet Union had a strategic rationale, but it was, there were attitudes that were put forward, ideas to justify the relationship in Washington. And one was that Deng Xiaoping, China's new leader, who was changing dramatically China's economic system, also intended afterwards or later on to change the political system. So then you get that proves not to be true. And after 1989, through the 90s, the idea that China is politically changing gets a new and different constituency, which is really the business community, because as trade and investment in China become ever more important, American companies and their counterparts in Europe or Japan found themselves repeatedly beset with questions about why they were doing so much business with a repressive regime, which in the 90s had fairly recently ordered its troops to fire on unarmed civilians. And so this idea of inevitable change offered really large companies, corporations, the answers they needed. Not only was China destined to open up its political system, but trade would be the key that would unlock the door. Now let me turn to look critically at the common arguments that are usually made for the idea that capitalism will bring democracy to China. The first is really an argument that is based in part on foreign policy. I call it the South Korea-Taiwan argument. It's an argument, I guess, from history as much as anything else. It's that South Korea and Taiwan had authoritarian governments through the 60s and 70s, and that they, as their economies progressed, opened up in the 1980s to democratic governments. And this analogy is made over and over and over again. And I question whether it fits. I don't think, because the larger fundamentals of foreign policy are not the same. At that time, South Korea and Taiwan had a security relationship, and they were dependent on the United States for their security. And the United States pushed hard, encouraged democratization in both Taiwan and South Korea. And Taiwan, really, the driving force was the American Congress, which kept pressing Taiwan to open up. South Korea, it's not, and that was over the course of a decade. In South Korea, you can put a date on it. I mean, there's a specific point with demonstrators in the streets in 1987 when the Reagan administration sends two emissaries to Seoul and really insists that Chun Doo-hwan, who was then the dictator of South Korea, open up for elections. And apart from these problems, the argument that China is going to head the way of South Korea or Taiwan, China is just a much bigger place. It's less tied to its coastal areas. If China were, as a country, specifically the city of Shanghai, then I think the argument would be stronger. So that's one argument. Then the second one involves the middle class. I call it the Starbucks fallacy. And I call it that because the columnist Nicholas Kristof wrote an interesting column a few years ago. He visited a Chinese Starbucks and then concluded no middle class is content with more choices of coffee than of candidates on the ballot. And again, that's an interesting idea, but to me, it just doesn't follow. The notion that China's middle class is going to turn to or push for democracy does not seem to be bearing out. Because the middle class really has close ties to, gets considerable benefits, whether it's travel or economic benefits, from the ruling party. And beyond that, if you think about the idea of democracy in China in one form or another, there's a tremendous fear by the elites in these cities, Beijing, Shanghai, that they would be outvoted. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of peasants in the farmland, I mean, in rural areas or on the outskirts of cities. And one way or another, it appears that China's middle class has accepted really its bargain with the Chinese government, which is we will allow you personal freedoms, the right to make money, just stay out of politics. And that brings me to the third idea, which is and really most common among tourists, I think, or visitors to China. The idea, it's clothes and personal freedom. People go to China, they see people on the streets of Shanghai wearing Armani suits. There's plenty of what we used to call sex, drugs, and rock and roll in China, where there certainly didn't used to be. And so people say China's opening up. And what does opening up mean? That it is opening up in those senses. But they haven't led to changes in the political system, and I don't think they will. And then there's the argument that people in China are pretty happy the way things are. I think this probably applies to the middle class in cities. There have been a couple of American pollsters who have found, when they ask in China, that people seem fairly content. And apart from the problems of polling, I was asked a while ago about to take a look at the questions that were being asked in an American poll of China, and there were a bunch of good questions. There was one or two that confused personal freedom and political freedom. The pollster said, "Well, what haven't I asked?" And I said, "Well, you haven't asked people whether the ruling party, the Chinese Communist Party, should be the sole legal authority in China." And the pollster said, "Of course I can't ask that." And of course I agree. I mean, that's, but in a way, I think the Chinese Communist Party does its own polling, or certainly keeps track of public opinion better than outside pollsters. And if it really thought that the people of China strongly supported the ruling party, I think it would find some way to have elections, to show it, to prove it. It's an unsupported claim. I think one scenario thrown out for China's future is that the Chinese Communist Party would behave or go down the route of Japan and have a ruling party that wins elections regularly. But one way or another, the idea that that people in China are happy with the government contradicts the idea that China is headed for democracy. Because if people are content, then within limits they won't press for change. Let me step back and say, why should we care? What difference does it make whether China is democratic or not? And I would say, the first reason I lived in China, I care for the people of China themselves. It's not for me to say, but it would be certainly nice for 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion people to have some voice or say in how they're governed. One of the cliches that you see when you live in China is that people in China don't care about politics, and I think that's kind of a stereotype that's proven false at the rare times when Chinese people have had the right or ability to speak out. The second reason we should care is for political stability. China did, I will say, manage a fairly smooth succession of leadership a few years ago, but it was the first one. And there's no guarantee of political stability in the future. And then the third reason we should care is a foreign policy one, which is that China has been providing in one way or another support for rulers like Robert Mugabe a few years ago, or for the junta in Burma. So that's a third reason. The last one, I think, is a matter of just being straightforward with the American people, because I think Americans have been told at every key juncture over the last 30 years that China was, our policies were going to lead to political change in China. So it would be, a coherent point of view to say there's nothing we can do. The Chinese system's going to stay the same. It's going to continue to repress opposition for decades. But we should go ahead anyway. That's not, and it is true that I think China is not going to change. But that's not the argument that our leaders have made about China over the past few decades, because I think if they're afraid that if they say that, they will lose public support or congressional approval. And so the bottom line is that our policy has been explained and justified on the basis of the false assumption that capitalism is going to lead to democracy in China. Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to take your questions. Yes.
Comment on the thought that to step toward democracy would require something like de-Stalinization or what Russia went through, and that Mao is still held up in a way that would seem to indicate they're not going to take that step of coming to terms with their past.
I agree with part of that and disagree with part. Yes, a kind of de-Stalinization would be, it's really a matter of coming to grips with the one-party state. Mao is a trickier subject because after his death, particularly in the late 70s, and then going on, they really went as far as they could to abandoning Mao. As far as they could meant, and there was a very specific formula, it was Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. But really, through the 70s and 80s, and the issues on this were not necessarily political. It was largely technology and modernization. They really abandoned Mao. And in the last few years, there's been a sort of a revival of Mao at the populist level. I mean, if people who get in a cab in Beijing will find, little Mao buttons or whatever. It's that Mao was a strong leader. So you're right. They would have to abandon Mao, but on their terms, they really have gone part of the way to doing that. Yes, sir.
With the rise of capitalism, it coincides with the Beijing Games that just went on and the controversy that surrounded the pollution in Beijing with athletes. Do you think the Olympic Games will prove to be a turning point in China investment on foreign oil to alternative energy sources that would maybe end up in a Kyoto agreement that the U.S. would sign, or that they would stick with this quick economic returns of foreign investment oil that would enable them to push their power politically, that would not allow democracy to happen, or not allow U.S. influence to have democracy happen in China?
I would separate out the Olympic Games. I don't think the Olympic Games will prove to be a long-term influence on China's specific policies like energy. And I would say that so far, what we've seen is China has maintained a fairly old and traditional view of the importance of energy. I don't see them moving towards signing the Kyoto Accords or radically changing their energy policy. Sure.
I wonder, what do you make of events after the earthquakes this summer? Reading some of the coverage, I think there was surprise that some of the senior leadership was so responsive to complaints about the collapsing schools and these sorts of things. And have you changed your analysis after seeing the earthquakes and the response this summer?
A little bit. There are a couple of aspects to that. One is the relationship between the central government and the provinces. So this was the latest and in some ways the most dramatic example that sometimes the central government maintains a distance from the provinces and is happy to say that provincial officials are not performing. For a brief period of time, I think it was about 10 days to 2 weeks, China, the press was allowed full scope to cover the issues, and there were some independent, some civil groups that were allowed to come in and provide help. And that was itself quite interesting, but it was quickly then closed down. So you get the subsequent issue of building school construction, faulty construction that produced some of the deaths in the earthquake. And now that's that's no longer a permitted subject in China. So there was it was, I mean, this was really an incredible natural disaster. It was a special time in which they did allow the press to report without guidance, and then that quickly there was at the time there was some speculation that really you couldn't undo this, and they quickly did. Sir.
Sir, what do you think are the implications of global competition between China and the U.S. for raw materials and other resources worldwide?
Certainly, we see it the most with respect to oil. China's energy policy. China actually, when I lived in China, it was actually exporting oil. It now needs more and more. And so, we see its energy policy show up in its relationship with countries like Iran, or for that matter, the Sudan. And one of the arguments that gets made in this town being Washington, I guess, is that this is not a zero-sum game, that the United States and China share an interest in maintaining the flow of oil and the supply of oil from the Middle East. I don't think or see that that's something that China necessarily accepts. So it hasn't showed up in their policy to any extent. Yes?
Sir, leading up to the Olympics, there was plenty of speculation that it would liberalize China's politics. And obviously, that wasn't true. With now the increased nationalism in China and the way the party was able to pull off this event without major incidents, do you think that's actually decreased the political liberalization in China in the current moment?
Well, there are three important points raised by your question. The first is it's important to note the changes in the politics leading up to the Olympics from, say, a decade ago. I was, as a newspaper correspondent, accompanied President Clinton on his trip to China in '98. And before that, there was what was called the Beijing Spring. In order to sort of smooth the way for Clinton's trip, there was a period when political groups, somewhat like the earthquake, not quite, were in this case, there was a formation of a China Democratic Party. And after Clinton left, that was the end. Leaders of the China Democratic Party in jail, the whole political opening closed up again. This time, with the Olympics, you really didn't have I thought, that I would have said 2 years before the Olympics that we'd see another version of that China would show that it was liberalizing or try to portray itself as liberalizing before the Olympics. And, you really didn't see that. It's quite a change in 10 years, and then I think it reflects China, the government's sense of strength and confidence. Remind me.
I was just
Yeah.
wondering if anything, the Olympics showed that this has decreased the possibility of political liberalization that everyone speculated on beforehand.
The other question is what happens after the Olympics, and I think people have not focused on that very much. The entire attention before the Olympics was on what happens during the games or before the games, rather than after the games. And I don't see, any sign of political liberalization. In fact, I would speculate that there'll be a tightening up over the next year or so. Yes?
Do you believe that the rise of blogs and other internet forums within China will strengthen or weaken the CCP's hold on power?
let me answer this and the other point I wanted to make on the previous question on nationalism in China, because what we've seen at various points, this was true after the embassy, the incident in Belgrade in 1999, and we've seen these nationalist outpourings at specific times. And one idea that I sort of hear in this country is that Chinese nationalism is bad, and I think that's too sweeping. It depends what kind of nationalism you mean. We're seeing a very specific kind of nationalism that China has been oppressed for 200 years. What's interesting about that is people assume that that's a constant. People assume that for, in an unending way, that China has tremendous resentments against the West, Europe, the outside world. It's true some of the time. I was in China in the 1980s. There's a statue of one of the Chinese heroes of the Opium War. This is most arguments about nationalism tend to go back to the Opium War. And it was moved further out. It was from the heart of Guangzhou way out to the suburbs, because really the dominant idea of nationalism in China in the 80s was one linked to opening up. And so, there's positive and negative nationalisms. Now, on the internet, you get, first of all, some of this outpouring of nationalism. That, in some ways, that serves the purposes of the ruling party. It is closely controlled. There are, and people found, even foreign correspondents or sports writers found during the Olympics, there were websites that you couldn't get access to. And so this is an argument put forward and sometimes by internet companies or American high-tech companies that the internet is going to change China. It is opening up the way for a bit of political discourse, but within careful limits. You can now, the importance of the internet is that you can get information from the outside. That really is a fundamental difference. I mean, you go back 30 or 40 years ago, there were people in China in the 60s who actually, visitors would find that people thought that Albania, which was then Mao Zedong's ally, was one of the biggest countries in the world. You don't have that now. You get people who can find out that there is a Green Party in Germany. They just can't organize a Green Party. That you can find out on the internet. You just can't write that there will be a meeting next Thursday of the local neighborhood organization of the Green Party. Yes?
Well, if most people, as you said earlier, or at least it seems like most people are content with how their government's running, what's the government's aversion to opening up a little bit? Because if they're confident, or it seems like there's a certain confidence that people are okay with things, I mean, is it just preventing? I mean, it seems like it's preventing something that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, that's the tension inherent. I think I probably didn't make myself clear. There are polls that I find of limited usefulness that people are content, but the government remains deeply insecure about public support. And so, what you say is right. If they were really, really confident that they had public support, they would open up more. But they lack that confidence. Yes?
If the change is coming, then what do you think is the tipping point
I don't think we are approaching a tipping point. I think that that there will be sort of modest changes over the next 20 years, but no tipping point and no dramatic change. I think that what we see is in many ways what we're going to get. Yes.
I have a question with regards to the, I guess you call the other Asian power, India, China.
Yeah.
I think in light of two things, the Indo-US nuclear deal, which is apparently going to, but also secondly, increasing bilateral trade and investment between India and China. Do you see China's policy towards India, particularly the northeastern states, highly contested borders, do you see that changing anytime soon?
So I think China's been very, very careful in dealing with India. I think that at the simplest level, they're really worried about alienating India to the point that it has a ever closer relationship with the United States. And it's certainly changed in the last 10 years. So I think China has been very careful to make sure that idea doesn't take hold in India, and really I think there's tremendous difference of opinions about China in India. I don't think you get the idea across the board in India that China is an enemy. So that's certainly, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but for now you don't see that.
So getting to a situation now, do we change our mentality or foreign policies on China?
These ideas about China are really have really persisted for about 30 years, and they may change slowly. I find that when presidents, when leaders are talking about China, that they are a little bit more inhibited about predicting inevitable change in China. It still shows up regularly in sort of speeches, news conferences. But I can see that idea gradually winding down. The question is what replaces it. So American leaders say, China is not going to change. We're going to have a one-party state and no political opposition for a long time. The question is whether there's public support for American policy towards China. The policy crystallized by the word engagement. I mean, I haven't talked about the idea of engagement. It is the sort of key phrase or slogan, and I'm really not sure that it has a lot, what it means, other than we have meetings, but that's about it. Okay. Yes, sir.
Sir, how do you think the enormous size of the population, along with the fact that families can only have one child, how do you think that'll play into the future of China?
Well, I'm now. This is not me. This is demographers answering. We're already seeing that China is headed down the road a few decades from now to a major problem of the graying of China, that China is going to have remarkably few workers. The ratio of workers to retirees is going to be smaller and smaller. And that is, to some extent, an outgrowth of the one China policy. I mean, one child policy. Yes?
So Hong Kong has exhibited a large per capita growth over the past 2 decades. What do you think are the essential political differences of Hong Kong versus broader China, which has?
Hong Kong is really politically unique because it was run by the British as a colony, and this is the Chinese PRC's argument. It was run by the British as its crown colony for a century, and really only in the 80s and beginning of the 90s did the British begin to allow any really development of democracy or representative government there. And so, the Chinese can claim accurately that there isn't a long tradition of democracy there. There is a tradition of a vibrant press, and I think that has been reined in. But when the Chinese claim that they are going to allow Hong Kong to run differently from the rest of China, it becomes less so over time, but it is still different. Yes.
Sir, what effects has the strategic economic dialogue had on mobilizing the Chinese economy? And has it had any strategic effects in the long run?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I can. We've had this strategic economic dialogue for 3 years or so. It brings together highest level economic officials in the U.S. government with their Chinese counterparts. It is, I think, a dialogue, one that without particular strategic impact that at least that anybody has seen. And I think it will probably be continued by the next administration, whatever happens in November. But I don't think we've seen, specific results yet. Yes?
So to what extent do you think the lack of democracy in China will affect its potential of being a superpower in the future? Do you think that it could be a superpower under communism?
Yes, I do. When I talked about political stability, it would be a superpower with some uncertain political future, but I don't think that the lack of democracy prevents it from. It is now an economic superpower. Its military is advancing. It used to be in the 80s that people spoke of China's as only a superpower within Asia, but its interests are extending beyond East Asia now. I think we can think of it may not be, it certainly isn't a superpower on the order of the United States, but it's certainly getting there. Yes.
Russia has just put its stake in the Chinese camp by investing in a nuclear power plant in Iran and Bangladesh. With China, you said, struggling for space for their population, and Russia decreasing in population by 500,000 people a year. Do you see China progressing into Russian territory or assimilating some sort of territory over the next 20 or 30 years in order to facilitate their needs economically?
It's a good question, and certainly if you get out to the Soviet Far East, in Siberia along the Russian borders with China, you'll find plenty of Russians who are worried, if not scared to death, that the Chinese are coming. I don't see any territorial changes, certainly not over the next, as you asked about, 20 or 30 years. I think you'll find, as you already do, more and more Chinese businessmen going in to the the Russian Far East, rather, and being increasingly active. But territorial changes, no. Yes?
Sir, what's the state of freedom of religion in China, and how are all these changes going to affect that?
Chinese have the Chinese government still keeps fairly strict control on independent religious groups. So religious organizations are supposed to have and do have representatives of the Communist Party or to deal with the Communist Party. This is something that gets played out with the Catholic Church, which I think for a long time has been eager to be able to get into China. But so far they haven't gotten past the idea that China has had its own patriotic church and doesn't want a Catholic organization that is ultimately responsible to the Vatican and not to Beijing. One other point on that, I guess it's an obvious one, but they're really scared to death, above all, I think, of sort of populist spiritual movements, specifically Falun Gong. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things that the Chinese government has done in the last 30 years or so, I think, was you had this very strange and mysterious Falun Gong crop up in China and spread. And the Chinese government's crackdown on Falun Gong was probably more severe than any other crackdown they've had. Yes?
Sir, how would you respond specifically to the argument that as China and the U.S. or China and the West in general continue to do business, they're really going to be involved in more treaties, organizations, where in order to hold up their end of the bargain, China's going to have to cut out corruption at the lowest level of the government. How would you respond to Stanford's concern, I guess, that democracy will flow from that, not so much from the middle class, but from cleaning up the corruption at the lowest level of the government and then spread it out?
You know, the first part I wholly agree with, that China is going to be more active in international, it is now and will be ever more active in international organizations. On local corruption, however, I don't think we're seeing changes for the better. And I think, one of the government problems in China is that you get the national government declaiming against corruption, but unable to do much at the local level, or unwilling to do much. I really shouldn't say unable, because if the issue is political dissent, then the Chinese security apparatus manages to have you can't have a meeting in a bar or a restaurant at the local level without someone knowing about it. When it comes to food safety, product safety issues at the local level, the government says it doesn't have the power to do anything, and right now it might not. The question is what kind of resources it would take to impose its policies on the local level, and they haven't been willing to do that. I have trouble seeing how that, if there were a large reduction in corruption, I'm not sure how that would necessarily lead to democracy. The one connection I see is this. One of the arguments that gets made for allowing a wider latitude for the press in China is that it will supervise corruption at the local level. That's an argument that gets made, and it gets made by reformers in China, I think. It hasn't taken hold, but I could see the press being allowed to write more and more about local corruption without necessarily touching on the question of the one-party state. Yes, sir.
Are you concerned with the lack of attention China is getting in the presidential campaign?
I think it's quite odd. The question was on the lack of attention China gets in the presidential campaign. One of the common assumptions, and that I've had as well, is that China comes up in nearly every campaign, that candidates take strong positions and they come into office, and they change their minds. And the basis for that is, what gave rise to that is the 1980 election, where Ronald Reagan made Taiwan a political issue, the 1992 election, where Clinton criticized the first Bush administration. And so people come to think that in every election, people are going to take China as an issue. I've been amazed at how little has been said about China now. It's not nothing. Before the Pennsylvania primary, Hillary Clinton showed up in Pittsburgh in front of, I think, a steelworkers audience and gave a speech about American economic policies towards China. She even verged over to security policies. And John Edwards before him, but really the candidates on both sides have been careful. I thought the proof that people wanted to stay away from China as a political issue came during the Democratic primaries, when the issue really was loss of jobs overseas. And people talked about China sometimes, but they settled on NAFTA. That became the issue. And I thought NAFTA, because, if you're talking about the legitimate question one way or another of the loss of jobs, China is vastly more significant. But I thought that the whole debate about NAFTA in the Democratic primary was, in a way, a stand-in for China, because the candidates really were nervous about talking about China. Yes?
I'm curious, you're taking a position that China's kind of going to stay the same. It's not really going to become a democracy. But they are growing economically and militarily. What do you think that means for kind of the U.S., China, Japan triangle militarily in that area? Do you think the fact that we're growing stronger economic ties with China and we have a security agreement with Japan, it'll bring more peace or more stability to the area? Or do you think it could create a conflict where the U.S. kind of has to decide between China and Japan?
I don't think the United States is going to have to decide. China really has, in some ways, changed its policy towards Japan. I think that the Chinese vision for Japan in security terms now is that Japan will be nervous or intimidated about China and will avoid conflict with China. Really, the policy going back to the 70s or 80s was that China, without saying so, was supportive of the U.S.-Japan alliance as a matter of Cold War policy. They never quite said so. And you get a whole bunch of Japanese nationalism. That's a recurrent theme in China. But I think that the real policy is to avoid military conflict, but to have a Japan which just avoids conflict with China. Yes?
I'm just curious, for the future of the Communist Party, is there any sentiment or any expectation of which direction the party's kind of going? Are the kind of up-and-coming people, basically where they are now, or is there kind of a wave of people
On the edges, you get sort of debates between conservatives and reformers in the party. I think that on the central elements of policy, that there's surprising little debate. One thing I've been watching, one reason I think that we're not seeing capitalism bring democracy to China is I thought that with more business activity, you would begin to get economic disputes and factions with different economic interests, whether it's macroeconomics or whatever. Haven't seen that. The current, Hu Jintao, current leader, really very much a technocrat. There's specific elements of policy he pushes, but not a lot of bold ventures. And compared to and this is an unusual example, compared to the China before Tiananmen, in the 3 or 4, 5 years before Tiananmen, where there was intense intra-party rivalry. I think they took from Tiananmen the demonstrations, the idea that they better hold together. And also they took from the Soviet collapse the idea that they better make sure that there was no Mikhail Gorbachev within this Chinese leadership. And they spent a lot of time and effort, I think, making sure that that's the case. Yes? I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. I haven't seen his speech, but did it suggest political liberalization? Or one thing about the discussion within the party now is that they are talking about the political changes are to make the party more accountable. And that means that really is a matter of corruption and trying to make sure that local governments or local officials are not corrupt, even allowing for press coverage of local issues. But I don't see a change in the fundamentals. Did you see in Xi Jinping's? Yeah. Yeah.
Like when I was in China last May, a lot of friends talk about that. They said even in the large Congress parties, whole Congress wasn't his party, some people suggest change the name. They say you need to change Congress name because Congress party name is so it's a bad name.
Yeah.
So then you will have some people started kind of propose ideas. Of course, that will be immediately wiped out. So no, we can't. But some people, the new leaders start having new ideas.
Yeah, that. Yeah. The idea of a new name makes sense to me. I mean, there was a point when Chinese government changed the Ministry of Propaganda to the Publicity Ministry not too long ago. And I've thought that at some point they may change the name to the Chinese Leadership Party or something like that.
We have time for one
Okay.
more question. I think is
Yes.
you raise your hand.
I just wonder if capitalism isn't going to bring democracy to China, are there some other variables that possibly could bring it? You mentioned Gorbachev, a leader like that might come up through the party and be a reformer, maybe even like an economic downturn that created some desire to reform, or even maybe U.S. pressure. Are there other variables besides capitalism that we should be looking for that could bring change? I'm doubtful there will be a Chinese Gorbachev. The one issue, and an economic downturn by itself, I don't think would produce change. I mean, large-scale environmental issues are one thing that has occurred to me. You do see some local, many of the local protests in Shanghai, for example. There's one about high-speed rail. And there are protests on environmental issues. How that becomes a nationwide movement, I'm not sure, but that's one thing I would watch.
I think the issue of China, it's so intense, so incredibly big, and one of the things when we talk about how capitalism might change China, how democracy might change China, the more proper perspective from, in my view, is how a rising China with increasing self-confidence will change capitalism, change democracy as we know it. And you see that in some of the global forces, one of the epitome of capitalist forces urges, like the internet, for example. Internet is supposed to be a global force, a triumph, as Tom Friedman very optimistically, sometimes foolishly optimistically saying, the earth is flat. But with a powerful force like internet, when it goes to China, China has changed the internet. All the internet giants go to China, you have to change the rule. You have to subject to the self-censorship rule, so they all really change it. So, and China has its own version of democracy. You change the name. Xi Jinping got the idea of changing the party name actually from his first maiden visit to North Korea. Because North Korea is a communist state, but the party there is not called the Communist Party. It's called Labor Party. So what does it mean? Do you have a what kind of a name without the true nitty-gritty of the election and those sort of things? What I'm saying is China is going to be very, very important in your life, and I think Jim has given us a very wonderful talk. And of course, during the time restricted, we cannot explore a lot of the issues in great detail. But he has written 4 books on China, so you can all buy online, paperback edition. And we'll continue this dialogue. And on 26th of this month, we have another talk on China's military implications, particularly Chinese military Navy expansion, and what does it mean to the U.S. Navy. And watch the internet announcement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Book plug.